One moment, Dr. Julian Thorne was a god, his voice commanding as he guided a multi-million-dollar robotic arm deep inside a patient's brain. The next, the world vanished. A catastrophic power failure plunged the state-of-the-art operating room into absolute, suffocating darkness, silencing every machine he relied on. Backup power. Give me backup power now. Thorne screamed, his voice no longer divine, but thin and laced with raw panic. Without his screens, his navigation, his robots, the world-renowned surgeon was blind and utterly useless. He felt a small presence move beside him and snarled into the blackness, "Don't just stand there, mouse, do something." It was Grace, the rookie nurse he always mocked. But as the great Dr. Thorne stood paralyzed by the darkness, he didn't feel her gently take a scalpel from the tray. He didn't hear her whisper to the anesthetist, "Keep his vitals steady. I'm going in by hand." He believed the patient was lost. He didn't realize the surgery was finally in the hands of a master. Just an hour earlier, the operating room had been Dr. Julian Thorne's kingdom, and he had been its undisputed god. Bathed in the brilliant, shadowless light of a dozen surgical lamps, he was a master conducting a symphony of technology. His stage was the most advanced neurosurgery suite in the world, a gleaming cathedral of glass and steel where his every whim was answered by a chorus of deferential staff and perfectly calibrated machines. "Watch this, gentlemen," he'd murmured, his voice broadcast to the observation gallery where a group of awestruck residents were watching. With a flick of his wrist, the multi-million-dollar robotic arm he controlled mimicked his movement perfectly, navigating a treacherous passage of the human brain with arrogant grace. Precision. That is the difference between a surgeon and a butcher. He'd extended his other hand without looking. 10mm retractor. Grace Alwood, his scrub nurse, had placed the instrument into his palm before the last syllable had left his lips. She was a ghost at his side, her movements economical and silent, her focus absolute. Thorne hadn't acknowledged her. He simply adjusted the retractor and said, his voice dripping with condescension, "A little faster next time, mouse. Some of us are trying to make history here." Senior Nurse Brenda, circulating the oar, had shot Grace a triumphant smirk. The message was clear: you are nothing. He is everything. Now, everything was nothing. The snap back to reality was a plunge into a cold, black abyss. The darkness was absolute, a physical presence that swallowed light, sound, and certainty. The only illumination was the faint, ghostly green glow of the anesthesiologist's battery-powered monitor, painting ghoulish shadows on the now silent machines. Thorne's panicked shouts echoed in the void. "Backup generator. What is the status?" A disembodied voice crackled over the OR's comm system, thin and strained with panic. "Main power grid is down for the entire city block. The primary backup, it failed to engage. We're trying the secondary system, but, dear God, it's not responding." The finality of the statement sank into the room. They were an island of advanced medicine, cut off from the power that gave it life. The futuristic hospital was now just a concrete tomb. Thorne, stripped of his technological divinity, became a mortal man, and a terrified one at that. Unacceptable, he roared into the darkness, pacing blindly. "This is the Vanguard Institute. How can both backups fail?" He wasn't thinking of the man lying open on his table, he was railing against the failure of the system that was supposed to make him infallible. His pacing was cut short as he stumbled into a small instrument tray, sending a cascade of sterile steel clattering across the floor. The god of the oar was clumsy in the dark. While Thorne raged, Grace was already moving. She was no longer a ghost, she was the only calm thing in a world of chaos. She was at the patient's head, the darkness sharpening her other senses. She could smell the faint, acrid scent of ozone from the failed electronics. She could hear the rising panic in the anesthetist's voice. "Vitals are dropping," the anesthetist, Dr. Ramirez, said, his voice tight. "BP is 90/50 and falling. He's losing pressure fast." Grace placed her gloved fingers gently on the patient's neck, finding the carotid artery. Her touch was her sight. She could feel the weak, thready pulse, a frantic, failing drumbeat. Brenda, Finally fumbling a small emergency flashlight from a wall kit, clicked it on. The thin, wavering beam sliced through the room, a frantic searchlight in the wreckage. It swept past the monitors, past Thorne's enraged face, and finally landed on Grace, whose hands were resting on the sterile drape just inches from the open surgical wound. "Alwood! What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Brenda shrieked, her voice a piercing stab of authority. "Step away from the patient. You're breaking sterile field." The beam of light was a beacon for Thorne's fury. He strode over, a looming shadow in the dark. "I told you to do something useful, mouse, not hover over him and play doctor." His voice was a low snarl. "There's an active bleed. Without the navigation system, I have no way of locating the source. Your fumbling around in the dark is going to send him into cardiac arrest." And then, Grace spoke. Her voice was not the timid whisper of the scrub nurse. It was low, steady, and utterly calm, cutting through the panic like a scalpel. "The bleed is located 2 centimeters distal to the bifurcation of the posterior cerebral artery," she said, her eyes not on him, but focused on some point in the darkness only she could see. "The source is the vessel's inferior trunk. I can feel the subtle pressure differential in the surrounding tissue." Thorne was stunned into silence. For a single, heart-stopping second, the entire room was still. Then, he let out a laugh. It was a sharp, ugly, disbelieving bark that echoed horribly in the confined space. "You can feel it," he spat, the words dripping with ridicule. "She's gone insane, Brenda. The rookie thinks she's a psychic." He turned his unseeing face toward Grace, his voice dropping to a dangerously low growl. "You are a nurse. Your only job is to hand me my instruments. But in case the darkness wasn't a clue, you can't even do that right now. So back away from my patient before I have security drag you out of my OR and I end your career. Is that clear?" The echo of Dr. Thorne's threat hung in the thick, black air, a promise of total annihilation. The single, wavering beam from Brenda's flashlight created a scene from a nightmare, Thorne's furious, hulking silhouette, Grace's small, still form, poised by the operating table, Brenda's own face, a mask of shocked disbelief. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply stood her ground, a silent, unmovable object in the path of Thorne's rampaging ego. The standoff was shattered by the voice of Dr. Ramirez from the anesthesiology station, now stripped of all its earlier cynicism and sharp with pure, unadulterated fear. "Blood pressure is 70/30 and dropping fast. Heart rate is bradying down to 50. He's crashing, Thorne. If we don't clamp that bleed in the next 90 seconds, he's going to seize from the pressure, and we lose him for good." 90 seconds. The number was a death sentence. "I can't see, you idiot." Thorne roared back, his voice cracking with the pathetic, desperate admission of his own impotence. "Someone get me a real light. A headlamp. Anything." He was a king screaming for a candle in his collapsed castle. The anesthetist's countdown was relentless. 80 seconds, people. In that moment, Grace made a decision. She was done waiting for permission. She turned to Brenda, and the quiet scrub nurse was gone. In her place was a commander. "Give me the light," she said, her voice so full of calm authority that Brenda, for a split second, almost obeyed. When Brenda hesitated, Grace simply reached out and plucked the flashlight from her stunned grasp. But she didn't aim it at the wound. Instead, she thrust it into the trembling hands of a junior resident who was trying to merge with the wall in the corner. "Hold this," Grace commanded. "Steady your hands and aim it exactly where I tell you to." She turned back to the main instrument tray. The clattering of steel from Thorne's earlier stumble had been a disaster, but the primary tray was intact. Her hand swept over the familiar shapes, her fingers reading the instruments by touch alone, a blind woman reading a language only she understood. "Suction," she said, not to anyone in particular, but to the room, an order expecting to be obeyed. A second resident, shaking, moved to comply. This was the final straw. Grace's usurpation of command was a rebellion Brenda and Thorne could not tolerate. "She's lost her mind." Brenda gasped. She's going to kill him. Thorne surged forward, his hand grabbing Grace's arm in a vice grip. I gave you a direct order, Alwood, he snarled, his face inches from hers in the dark. I told you to stand down. Grace didn't try to pull away. She simply met his unseen gaze, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. And I am telling you, Doctor, that you are standing by while this man dies. Is that your final, direct order? The question struck him like a physical blow. It was an accusation of malpractice, of cowardice, of failure, all wrapped in a challenge he couldn't escape. He was trapped. His pride, his career, his entire identity were on the line. In a final, desperate act of self-preservation, fueled by pure, unadulterated rage, he let her go and spat out the ultimate challenge. Fine, he hissed, the word venomous. You want to play God in the dark, mouse? Be my guest. You have your 90 seconds to stop a bleed you can't see in a brain you have absolutely no right to touch. He leaned in closer, his voice a promise of ruin. But when his heart stops, and it will, I will not just end your pathetic little career. I will stand in a courtroom and personally testify until you are charged with manslaughter. The gauntlet was thrown. Brenda stared, a horrified thrill running through her. This was either the end of Grace Alwood, or the end of everything she understood. Grace offered no reply. She didn't have time. The anesthetist's voice was the only clock that mattered. 60 seconds. Heart rate is in the 40s. She turned to the terrified resident holding the flashlight. Aim the beam at my hands. Don't move. The weak, pathetic circle of light landed on her gloved fingers. It illuminated almost nothing of the surgical cavity itself, but it gave her a point of reference. It was all she needed. She took one deep, centering breath. Her hands, holding a pair of DeBakey forceps and the suction tip, hovered over the patient. 50 seconds. The room was utterly silent now, save for the frantic, fading beeps of the heart monitor and the sound of Grace's calm, steady breathing. Dr. Thorne and Nurse Brenda stood back, invisible predators in the dark, waiting, praying for her to fail. Her hands descended into the darkness of the open wound. The countdown to oblivion had begun. The countdown is on, and Grace is about to risk her entire future on a surgery she can't even see. Before we dive back into that darkness, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where you had to trust your gut, to rely on a skill you have, even when everyone around you was panicking and telling you to stop? This channel is for everyone who believes in that kind of courage. It's for the quiet experts and the hidden masters. If that's you, hit that subscribe button right now. Let's hold our breath together and see if a steady hand is enough to beat the darkness. 45 seconds. The voice of the anesthetist was a grim metronome, counting down to the patient's death. The only light in the world was a weak, trembling circle cast by the penlight, illuminating Grace's hands as they disappeared into the dark, bloody cavity of the surgical opening. To Dr. Thorne, it was a horrifying sight, the clumsy, blind fumblings of an incompetent nurse who was about to murder a man on his table. To Grace, the darkness was a gift. It silenced the noise. The endless, distracting data from a dozen screens, the intimidating presence of the robotic machinery, the judgmental stares from the gallery, it was all gone. The darkness forced a focus so pure, so absolute, that the world shrank to the space beneath her fingertips. Her mind, a library of anatomical texts and thousands of hours of obsessive study, ignited. She wasn't seeing with her eyes, she was building a perfect, three-dimensional, holographic map of the patient's brain inside her head. Her hands were no longer just hands, they were precision instruments, reading the landscape of the mind. She could feel the slick, delicate membrane of the pia mater, the gentle, life-giving pulse of the major arteries. Her left index finger detected the unnatural pressure of the hematoma, the pooling blood that was crushing the life out of the patient's brainstem. It felt like a subtle, boggy wrongness in a landscape that should be firm and resilient. She's just probing blindly, Thorne whispered to Brenda in the shadows, his voice a venomous cocktail of fear and disgust. She has no idea where she is. He'll throw a clot and have a massive stroke any second now. This is butchery, Brenda agreed, her voice shaking with rage. She's not holding the forceps with the correct tension. I'll testify to that myself. She's going to prison for this. 30 seconds. Heart rate is down to 40, Dr. Ramirez called out, his voice strained. Pressure is bottoming out. Grace ignored them. Their words were the meaningless chatter of a world she had left behind. Her focus was on the path of the posterior cerebral artery. Her training, the official, textbook knowledge, told her that the aneurysm was almost certainly located on the superior trunk, the vessel's main branch. But her fingers told her a different story. The pressure, the subtle vibration of the bleed, it wasn't coming from there. It was weaker, further down. A memory flared in her mind, a footnote in an obscure neurosurgical journal she'd read years ago. It described a 1 in a million anatomical variant, a case study about a ghost aneurysm on the inferior trunk that was impossible to spot on standard angiograms. A case that had ended in the patient's death. It was a gamble, a wild leap of faith based on a half-remembered paragraph and the feeling in her fingertips. She moved her instruments away from the correct location and began to explore the vessel's inferior branch, a path into uncharted territory. From his station, Dr. Ramirez watched the grim numbers on his screen. He was preparing a syringe of atropine, the last-ditch chemical kickstart for a dying heart. But his eyes kept flicking to the small, illuminated circle of surgery. He was an anesthesiologist. His entire job was to read the subtle language of the human body. And what he was seeing didn't match the hysteria he was hearing from Thorne. Grace's movements weren't frantic or random. They were economical, deliberate, and precise. It didn't look like panic. It looked like a search. 15 seconds. Heart rate is 35. We're on the edge. Grace's fingers stopped. The skin of her glove, stretched over her index finger, registered a change. A tiny, almost imperceptible flaw in the arterial wall. A place that felt thin, fragile, and vibrated with the furious, high-pressure spray of escaping blood. It was here. The ghost. Suction, she whispered, her voice steady. The second resident, anticipating her, placed the cool metal tip in her waiting hand. She guided it down, her other hand a blind shepherd, directing the tip toward the tiny point of rupture. 10 seconds. He's gone, Thorne muttered, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. 5-4. Just as Dr. Ramirez was about to announce the end, Grace placed the suction tip directly over the bleed. For a fraction of a second, the torrent of blood was cleared away, exposing the torn vessel. Wait, Dr. Ramirez said suddenly, his face inches from his monitor. Hold on. The room held its breath. The intracranial pressure, he said, his voice a stunned whisper. It just stabilized. For the first time in 5 minutes, the pressure inside his skull is no longer rising. It just stopped. Thorne and Brenda couldn't understand the significance. But Ramirez did. He had just witnessed a direct, causal link. Her blind action in the dark had just produced the first positive data point in a sea of catastrophic failure. It was impossible. It was a statistical anomaly. But it was happening. Your monitor is failing, Ramirez. The pressure sensor must be malfunctioning. Dr. Thorne's voice shot through the darkness, a desperate attempt to deny the impossible. She probably dislodged it when she was fumbling around in there. Brenda added, her words a frantic echo of Thorne's denial. They were clinging to the wreckage of their certainty, refusing to believe what they were hearing. A fluke. A machine error. Anything was more plausible than the rookie nurse succeeding where the great Dr. Thorne had been rendered helpless. But Dr. Ramirez, his eyes glued to his screen, knew it wasn't a fluke. The waveform is clean. The sensor is seated perfectly, he retorted, his voice tight with a dawning, electrifying awe. The pressure isn't rising because the bleed has been contained. For the love of God, Thorne, she found it. Grace heard none of it. The outside world was a muffled roar. Her entire consciousness was focused in her fingertips. The suction had given her a precious, 1-second window of clarity, and she had seen, felt, the truth. She knew the exact location, the exact size of the tear. Now, she had to fix it. Microclamp, she said, her voice a calm, unwavering command. And a number 3 DeBakey forceps. The junior resident, his earlier terror now replaced by a stunned, nascent respect, slapped the instruments into her waiting palm without a word. What followed was not surgery in any conventional sense. It was more like safecracking in the dark, on a living lock that would kill its owner if jostled. The weak beam of the flashlight was useless for illumination, serving only to cast a dramatic shadow of her hands on the far wall. The real work was happening in a world of pure touch. Her left hand was her eyes, the fingers resting with feather-like pressure on the artery, bracketing the tiny, fluttering tear. Her right hand, holding the microclamp, became an extension of her will. She could feel the faint, almost imperceptible vibrations of the damaged vessel walls. She could feel the life force of the patient pulsing beneath her touch. The mental map in her head was now overlaid with real-time sensory data. She moved the clamp forward, millimeter by painstaking millimeter, her movements fluid, economical, and absolutely certain. What is she doing? Thorne hissed to no one in particular, his voice a raw whisper of disbelief. Ramirez answered, his voice a running commentary of the unfolding miracle. ICP is still holding steady, it's not a fluke, it's real. Wait a minute. There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath. Blood pressure is rising. Slowly. We have 75/40. Thorne, the BP is rising. Grace felt the delicate, paper-thin walls of the artery. She felt the jagged edge of the tear. She opened the tiny, serrated jaws of the microclamp, a miniature silver crescent in the dark. She positioned it, her mind calculating the precise angle needed to seal the tear without occluding the entire vessel. The fate of the man on the table, the future of her own life, the entire reality of this room, it all came down to this one, single, blind compression. She closed the clamp. The soft metallic click was barely audible, but it was the loudest sound in the history of the world. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. And then, Dr. Ramirez's voice exploded through the silence, no longer awestruck, but utterly, joyfully unhinged. IT stopped. The bleed has stopped. I can see it on the arterial line waveform, the pressure just equalized. He let out a choked, incredulous laugh. BP is 90/50. No, wait, 100/60 and climbing. Heart rate is coming up. 80. 90. It's 92 and steady. He slammed his hand on his console, the sound making the residents jump. She did it, he gasped, his voice cracking with emotion. The crazy, quiet rookie actually went in blind and stopped a cerebral bleed. She did it. Silence. The torrent of denials from Thorne and Brenda had run dry. There was no argument left. No rationalization could stand against the evidence being broadcast by the monitors. The numbers were irrefutable. The science was absolute. The beeping of the heart monitor, which had been a slow, fading funeral dirge, was now a strong, steady, life-affirming rhythm. It was the sound of their arrogance being shattered. It was the sound of their world being broken. It was the sound of Grace's impossible victory. The patient wasn't just saved from the brink. He was stable. And the person who had pulled him back was the one they had called a mouse. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound. A minute ago, it had been a funeral drum, now, it was a proclamation of life. It echoed in the stunned silence, a sound so normal it felt utterly miraculous. Dr. Ramirez, slumped over his console, let out a long, shuddering breath he seemed to have been holding for an eternity. He pushed his glasses up his nose and looked past his monitors, into the darkness where Grace worked, his expression one of a man who had just seen the laws of physics rewritten. His professionalism, shattered by the event, began to reassemble itself, but its hierarchy was now completely reconfigured. He was no longer a subordinate to Thorne, he was an ally to Grace. "All right," he said, his voice clear and taking command. "Alwood bought us a miracle. Let's not waste it." The second the power is back, I want a full blood panel and a head CT. Someone get the battery-powered backup suction unit ready, just in case. The nurses and residents, who had been frozen in a state of shock, now moved with purpose, their orders coming not from the chief of surgery, but from the anesthetist and the quiet rookie nurse. Grace's own work wasn't finished. Stopping the bleed was only half the battle. I need to irrigate the surgical cavity and check for any secondary damage, she said. Her voice remained soft, but it now carried the immense, undeniable weight of her authority. Suture. 4-0 Neurolin, on a tapered needle. The junior resident who had been holding the flashlight now functioned as her scrub nurse, his terror replaced by a reverent focus. He slapped the suture into her hand, his own hand still trembling, not with fear, but with an awe so profound it bordered on worship. In the shadows near the wall, Thorne and Brenda were prisoners of their own failure. The steady, life-giving beep of the monitor was their damnation, each pulse a testament to their impotence. What could Thorne possibly say? Good job, mouse. The words would turn to ash in his mouth. He was a king who had been deposed in his own throne room, and all he could do was watch the peasant who had overthrown him rule with a grace he had never possessed. Brenda simply stared, her mind locked in a loop of denial and humiliation. The quiet, insignificant girl she had spent months belittling had just performed a feat of surgical genius that would be told in the halls of this hospital for 50 years. Grace worked on, her hands moving with a steady, practiced rhythm, closing the delicate layers of tissue that protected the human brain. She was just placing the final internal stitch in the durometer when the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then, with a loud hum, the full, brilliant, uncompromising power of the surgical lamps flooded the room. The sudden transition from darkness to blinding light was a physical shock. It revealed a stunning, silent tableau that would be seared into the memory of everyone present. It showed Grace, leaning over the patient, her movements fluid and perfect, a portrait of absolute focus. It showed the monitors, displaying a full set of strong, stable vital signs. It showed the faces of the junior staff, all turned to Grace, their expressions of awe and reverence laid bare in the bright light. And it exposed Dr. Julian Thorne and Nurse Brenda. They stood near the wall, looking pale, small, and shockingly irrelevant. The light didn't just illuminate them, it judged them, revealing them as hollow shells of the authority they once held. Grace didn't even flinch. The return of the light was incidental to her process. She continued her suturing, her technique flawless, each knot a small, perfect masterpiece of surgical artistry. Thorne watched her hands. He wasn't just watching a nurse close an incision. He was watching a prodigy. And in that moment, the final, crushing truth landed on him with the weight of a physical blow. She wasn't just lucky. She wasn't just a competent nurse with a strange skill. She was a master. And she was better than him. Grace took the surgical stapler and placed the final staples in the skin, closing the last of the wound. Time, she asked softly. A nurse, startled, looked at the clock. 2:34 a.m. Surgery complete, Grace said. She stepped back from the table, peeling off her blood-stained gloves with a sigh of bone-deep exhaustion. The room was silent. The patient was saved. No one knew what to say. The spell was finally broken by the young resident who had held the flashlight. He looked at Grace, his eyes shining, and spoke for everyone in the room. That, he said, his voice choked with emotion, was the most incredible thing I have ever seen, ma'am. He called her ma'am. The word, a simple honorific, was a revolution. It sealed the transfer of power, the recognition of a new, true authority in the room. Grace looked at him, and for the first time, a small, tired, but genuine smile touched her lips. As the patient, now stable, was carefully wheeled out of the operating room and toward the ICU, a strange new protocol established itself in the room. The staff, from the junior residents to the grizzled anesthesiologist, moved around Grace Alwood with a quiet, almost reverent deference. They didn't crowd her or bombard her with questions. Instead, they gave her a pocket of space, a silent and visible perimeter of profound respect. The hero of the hour was granted a moment of peace. All of this quiet reverence only served to make the isolation of Dr. Thorne and Nurse Brenda more absolute. They stood near the now discarded robotic arm controller, a monument to their irrelevance. No one looked at them. No one spoke to them. The team they had commanded just hours ago now treated them as if they were ghosts. Their authority vanished, their presence a source of deep, collective embarrassment. They were utterly alone in the center of their former kingdom. Eventually, the room was empty, save for the three of them. The silence was deafening. Without a word, Thorne turned and pushed through the doors, Brenda following a half-step behind like a shadow. Their walk down the long, sterile corridor was a gauntlet of whispers. The story, carried by the residents and nurses who had been there, had already outrun them. They could feel it in the way heads turned as they passed, and the way conversations abruptly stopped, only to resume in hushed, excited tones the moment they were out of earshot. The entire social and professional fabric of the hospital was reweaving itself in real time, and they were being woven out of it. Brenda reached the nurses' lounge, intending to retreat and regroup, but found the room full of her own staff, who fell silent and stared at her, not with fear, but with a new, unnerving pity. There was no refuge for her here. Thorne made it to the heavy, mahogany door of his private office, a sanctuary with his nameplate on it in bold, gold letters. But before he could touch the handle, a crisp, calm voice cut through the hallway. "Not in there, Julian." He turned. Dr. Eris Thorne, chief of surgery and his older sister, stood at the far end of the hall. She was a legend in the hospital, a surgeon whose skill was matched only by her ruthless intolerance for ego that jeopardized patient care. Her expression was like carved granite. "My office. Both of you. Now." The walk to her office was the longest of their lives. Dr. Eris Thorne's office was a masterpiece of minimalist power, all sharp angles and cold glass, with a panoramic view of the city. She didn't offer them a seat. She stood behind her vast, empty desk, a judge before two criminals. She had already spoken to Ramirez, to the residents, to everyone. She fixed her cold, analytical gaze on her brother. "Dr. Ramirez's official report, which I have right here," she said, tapping a tablet on her desk, "states that during the power failure, you were, and I quote, rendered professionally impotent and audibly panicked. Is that an accurate assessment of your performance, Doctor?" Julian paled. "Eris, the situation was unprecedented." "I did not ask for an excuse," she cut him off, her voice like ice. "I asked for a confirmation." He swallowed hard. "I was unable to proceed." Her gaze shifted to Brenda. "And you, nurse? My staff tells me you actively attempted to obstruct Nurse Alwood, that you accused her of hysteria, and that your primary concern was a breach of sterile field while her primary concern was the actively dying patient. Is this true?" "I was following protocol." Brenda blurted out, her voice defensive. She was a junior nurse acting erratically. She was a rogue element. "A rogue element," Eris repeated, a dangerous lack of inflection in her voice. "And you, Julian? What is your professional assessment of this rogue element?" Thorne saw his opening. She was insubordinate. She disobeyed a direct order to stand down. In a stable environment, that would be grounds for immediate termination. Dr. Eris Thorne listened, her expression unreadable. She let the silence hang in the air for a moment, then leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Protocol. Insubordination. I see." She picked up a thick personnel file from her desk. "I suppose in your self-aggrandizing preparations for your history-making surgery, Julian, you never bothered to read the file of the scrub nurse I assigned to your team." She opened the file. "You see, I've had my eye on her. I read every line. Which is why I know what neither of you bothered to learn." She paused, letting the moment stretch to a point of unbearable tension, before delivering the final, devastating blow. "I know that Nurse Alwood is actually Dr. Grace Alwood, the top surgical resident from Johns Hopkins, class of 2022. The 3-time recipient of the prestigious Wayland Grant for neuroanatomical research. A certified prodigy who, according to this file, voluntarily withdrew from her surgical residency for personal reasons. The color drained from Thorne's and Brenda's faces. The revelation was a physical shock, a blow to the gut that left them breathless. Eris leaned back, her voice now a low, lethal whisper. She wasn't breaking protocol, Julian. She was falling back on a level of training that you, in your blind panic, could not possibly comprehend. She wasn't a rogue element, Brenda. She was the most qualified person in that entire goddamn room. She stared at them both, her face a mask of cold fury. And now, I want you both to explain to me, in very small words, why I shouldn't walk directly from this office to an emergency board meeting and have you both stripped of your surgical and nursing privileges before the sun comes up. The revelation of Grace's past hung in the air of the pristine office, a fact so absolute it shattered any possibility of defense. Julian Thorne and Brenda stood in the ruins of their own arrogance, exposed and utterly defeated. Julian, the surgical god, had tried to end the career of a prodigy. Brenda, the guardian of protocol, had tried to obstruct a master. Dr. Eris Thorne looked at them, her expression not one of anger anymore, but of a cold, profound disappointment. Termination would be too easy, she said, her voice quiet and cutting. It would allow you to become martyrs, to spin a story of hospital politics. No. Your education will be more practical. She looked at her brother. Julian, effective immediately, you are on a 1-year, zero-tolerance probation. You will be removed as head of this department. You will not lead a single surgery. You will assist. You will be supervised by a rotating senior surgeon on every procedure you are a part of. Your name is to be removed from the Institute's letterhead and all pending publications. You will learn humility, or you will learn what it's like to be a surgeon who is not allowed to cut. Then, she turned to Brenda. And you. You love protocol so dearly. Your new protocol will be this: you will report to the sub-level basement at 7 a.m. tomorrow. You are being permanently reassigned as the manager of Central Sterile Supply and Inventory. You will count scalpels, you will order gauze, and you will ensure that every single OR has the supplies it needs to function. You will not set foot on this surgical floor again. The punishments were masterpieces of corporate cruelty. Not firing them, but demoting them to positions of such profound humiliation that they would be living monuments to their own failure. There was no room for argument. They were dismissed with a curt nod. An hour later, Dr. Eris Thorne found Grace in a small, empty staff lounge. She was sitting at a table, a small silicone suture pad and a needle driver in front of her, her hands moving through the familiar, comforting rhythm of practicing her knots. The world had just turned upside down, and she had reverted to the one thing that had always made sense to her. I thought I might find you here, Eris said, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. Grace looked up, startled. Dr. Thorne. I believe, under the circumstances, Eris said, a faint, wry smile on her lips, you can call me Eris. And I should be calling you Dr. Alwood. Grace looked down at her practice pad. I'm not a doctor anymore. I'm a nurse. That's a distinction on a piece of paper, and we both know it, Eris countered. She pulled up a chair and sat opposite Grace. Your file is thin on the details of why you left Johns Hopkins. But I've been in this business a long time. I know a surgeon who was burned out by the ego and the politics when I see one. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. I can make one phone call. Your residency can be reinstated here, at Vanguard, effective tomorrow. I will personally supervise your progress. We can fast-track you. In 2 years, you could have Julian's old job. You've more than earned the right to take back the career that was stolen from you. It was the offer of a lifetime. A return to glory. A chance to reclaim everything she had lost. Grace looked at her own hands, at the needle and thread. She thought of the darkness, of the feeling of her fingers navigating the delicate pathways of the brain, of the quiet certainty she had felt in that moment. It was a certainty she had never felt while chasing titles and accolades. Thank you, Eris, she said, her voice full of genuine gratitude. But I can't. Eris looked surprised. Why not? Because you're right, Grace said. I did get burned out by the ego. My own included. I became a nurse to remember what it felt like to be in service to the patient, not in service to my own ambition. If I go back to being a surgeon, I'm afraid I'll forget again. She looked up, a new, clear purpose in her eyes. But I don't want to count gauze either. You have a new generation of residents who can fly a surgical robot before they can tie up proper surgeons not by feel. They trust the machines more than their own hands. Let me teach them. Let me be a clinical instructor for the residency program. Let me show them what to do when the lights go out. 3 months later. In O3, Dr. Julian Thorne, his face a permanent mask of bitter resentment, stood silently as he suctioned a bleed for the new head of neurosurgery. He was a ghost in his own kingdom. In the basement, Brenda scanned a barcode on a box of catheters, her movements robotic, her eyes hollow. She was the queen of a silent, sterile empire of cardboard and steel. In the surgical skills lab, Grace Alwood stood behind a cocky young resident, a boy who reminded her painfully of a younger Julian Thorne. The simulator says my microsuture tension is perfect, the resident complained, frustrated. But it looks like a mess. Grace gently placed her hand over his. The resident flinched, surprised by the contact. Close your eyes, Grace said softly. He looked at her, confused, but obeyed. Now, forget the simulator, she whispered. Forget the screen. Just feel. Feel the pull of the tissue. Feel the memory in your muscles as the knot sets. The machine can tell you what you did. Only your hands can tell you how you did it. The resident was still for a long moment. Then, his own tense hands relaxed, and a look of dawning comprehension spread across his face. Grace smiled. Her victory wasn't the reclaimed title or the corner office. It was this. It was teaching a new generation of gods how to be human. Grace's incredible story is a powerful reminder that technology is a tool, but true mastery will always reside in our own hands and in our own minds. Her greatest strength wasn't in a multi-million-dollar robot, it was in the quiet confidence of her own skill, a power that no blackout could ever extinguish. Now, I want to ask you, what is the skill you possess that requires no electricity and no screens? A talent you've honed with your own hands, your own memory, or your own heart? Let's fill the comments with a celebration of real, human ability. Share your unique skill below. And if you believe in the power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our community for more stories like this one. Thank you for watching.